Good day, Rhonda here, reading from the Lost Gospel, the Book of Q and Christian Origins, Part 3. The Recovery of a Social Experiment. 3.1 Dancing with the Pipes. Q is packed with bright, memorable sayings. Some are pithy aphorisms such as "Don't judge and you won't be judged." Others ride on picturesque images like gathering figs from a thorn bush or what happens to tasteless salt. Exhortations that recommend striking behavior abound, as in the injunction to offer the other cheek when slapped. Succinctly phrased observations on the everyday world collide with clever conclusions about the wily ways of human pursuits. Anecdotes, parables, colorful condensations of epic lore, and pointed apocalyptic pronouncements fill the horizon of an imaginative world that stands to challenge the status quo. Q bristles with critical judgments on truths held to be self evident and social conventions that most people would have taken for granted. Q's challenge to its readers was to have another look at their world and dare to dance to a different time. To a different tune. Excuse me. However, sorting through these sayings to find the reasons for such talk is a difficult exercise. At first, one has the impression of a motley collection of ad hoc material put together in a helter skelter fashion. One hardly knows what to make of it as a whole. The older theory about Q's composition was based on this impression. It held that these sayings traveled separately in oral tradition, that each saying was considered an important pronouncement in its own right, and that each was added to various collections made at different times for the purpose of convenience and the preservation of sayings held to be sacred because Jesus had said them. Compositional design was therefore not to be expected. This theory still has some value, for it recognizes that Q was reworked at several stages in a community that collected and cultivated these sayings over a long period. Many of the sayings seem to be out of place, appearing to reflect different periods in the life of the community. Some sayings suggest a very early period in the community's life. Don't worry, you are worth more than the birds. While others deal with issues and questions that could only have arisen later. Rejoice when they reproach you. That is exactly how they treated the prophets. And some sayings appear to have been added to the collection in order to address the situation of the community in the period after the Jewish war. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, your house is left desolate. But as soon as one sees that the sayings cluster and that clustering shows signs of purpose, a closer analysis is necessary. Recent studies have shown that it is possible to be quite precise about the reasons for the clusters and their arrangement in the larger collection. One can see blocks of material organized by theme sayings that illustrate or comment upon others, and small units of what the Greeks would have called a complete argumentation. Frequently, the way sayings are grouped or ordered makes a point. Sometimes a saying offers a specific interpretation of a preceding unit of material or draws a conclusion that redirects the significance of a theme and points to the next cluster. If one pays careful attention to shifts in features such as grammar, tenor, formal characteristics, and implied audience, strategies can be discerned that indicate compositional design rather than simple aggregation. Discrete stages in the literary history of such a collection are much more difficult to identify. That is because, in the nature of the case, rearrangements in the order of proverbial material frequently erase the design of previous collections. And since it is always the arrangement of proverbial material that provides the literary context for interpreting a particular figure of speech, earlier connotations are easily lost. A breakthrough occurred when it was seen that 7 clusters of sayings in Q share distinctive features that are missing in the rest of the material. Some of these clusters are carefully composed rhetorical units, and all of them address a coherent set of issues with the same audience in view and the same concerns in mind. When analyzed, these compositions do not need the rest of Q in order to make sense as a set of instructions. Further study established that excuse me, that the scribes responsible for Q as a whole had reason not to entirely erase the design of this earlier collection. That fortuitous accident of scribal history retaining earlier instructional material that happened to be in the form of small compositions makes it possible to isolate an earlier layer of the tradition in Q and thus an earlier stage in the history of the Q community. These 7 clusters are now recognized as the remains of the earliest collection of sayings in the Q tradition. The layer of Q material called Q1, they are precious nuggets indeed. A thorough account of the scholarly excavation of these foundation stones is hardly possible, for the labor has been painstaking and the arguments intricate. But we need to understand the reasons scholars have marshaled for being so sure about the assignment of these clusters to the early layer of the Q tradition. Some of these reasons have to do with the identification of seams, places where it is obvious that sayings were added or joined to others when elaborating or expanding upon themes. In order to be certain about seams, a mastery of Greek syntax is required. But even in English translation, thematic shifts are easily seen, and careful attention to the sequence of material will often reveal the logic of primary and secondary considerations in the development of themes and the conjunction of blocks or units of speech. An example is the reference to sodium, excuse me, an example is the reference to Sodom in QS 30. Oh, having a little tongue twister here. One more time. An example is the reference to Sodom in QS 21, a saying that picks up on the immediately preceding Q1 saying about an unreceptive town and shifts to the Q2 theme of judgment on Galilean towns elaborated in the sayings that follow. Identifying seams where material was added to prior material is a standard procedure in the study of sayings, collections, and instructional handbooks of antiquity. Seams tell us that collections were frequently changed in the process of transmission by means of notations, additions, deletions, and the reorganization of material. Sayings collections called Nomal, I'm going to spell it Gnomologia. That's from gnome, meaning maxim, nomologia. I think that's as close as I'm going to get. Um, sayings collections were not considered sacred literature and that should be left intact and passed on just as it had been received. A second set of reasons has to do with the coherence of a given layer of material in the development of a tradition. Reading through the document as a whole, different types of material that share similar features begin to emerge. Features of importance for determining the coherence of a layer of tradition include themes such as the announcement of judgment in Q2, style, such as the imperatives in Q1, and rhetorical strategies, such as the appeal to nature as an argument in Q1. The form of address to a particular audience can also help identify a layer of material, as can be a certain attitude toward the world. The similarity of literary genres and the order and organization of material are also clear signs of the coherence of a particular layer of tradition. In the case of Q, three distinct layers have been identified, which are called Q1, Q2, and Q3. Two of these, Q1 and Q2, are clearly coherent in style and content. Q2 is also coherent in organization. Q3 consists only of fragmentary additions, but these fragments do share a distinctive set of themes. Thus, each layer can be understood as a stage in the reinterpretation of the teachings of Jesus. A third set of reasons for knowing that the aphoristic material in Q1 is earlier than the prophetic pronouncements in Q2 or the mythology of Q3 has to do with matters pertaining to sequence in the growth of a tradition. In order to establish sequence, scholars pay attention to the logical and rhetorical effect of the seams between layers of coherent material. The effect of seams on the meaning of adjoining units and consistent patterns of framing one type of material by another type of material frequently reveal attempts to re-signify previous sayings. It is often the case that authors of later editions show knowledge of and interest in the material they framed, whereas the authors of earlier material do not show any knowledge of the later material. If the earlier material does not need the later material to make its point, the direction of development is given. Since Q2 presupposes and depends on Q1, whereas Q1 makes perfectly good sense as the discourse of a community without Q2. The stages of the composition must have run from Q1 to Q2. Common sense can also be called upon to reconstruct the sequence of these layers of tradition. For example, it is not reasonable to think that the playful style of repartee characteristic of Q1 entered the tradition after its discourse had taken on the serious and hostile stance towards the world characteristic of Q2. This chapter focuses on the sayings in Q1. The plan is to identify the nature of this discourse, recreate the social and conceptual world to which the style belonged, and use the content of its instructions to reconstruct the earliest period of the Q movement. The 7 clusters assigned to Q1 are the following. Number 1, Jesus's teaching. QS8 on those who are fortunate. QS9 on responding to reproach. QS10 on making judgments. QS11 on teachers and students. QS12 on hypocrisy. QS13 on integrity. QS14 on practical obedience. Number 2, Instructions for the Jesus movement. QS 19 on becoming a follower of Jesus. QS 20 on working for the kingdom of God. Number 3, confidence in the Father's care. QS 26, how to pray. QS 27, confidence in asking. Number 4, on anxiety and speaking out. QS 35, on speaking out. QS 36, on fear. Number 5, on personal goods. QS 38, foolish possessions. QS 39, on food and clothing. QS 40, on heavenly treasure. Number 6, parables of the kingdom. QS 46, the mustard and the yeast. 7, the true followers of Jesus. QS 50, on humility. QS 51, the Great Supper. QS 52, on the cost of being a disciple. QS 53, savorless salt. Embedded in these blocks of Q1 material are a number of terse sayings that give the collection its distinctive tone. An example is the saying in QS 39 that life is more than food. Every smaller unit of composition has at least one terse saying. Some are formulated as maxims, others as imperatives, but all have the quality of aphoristic speech. Most of these aphorisms function within their units as core sayings around which the unit clusters, or on which supporting considerations build. When viewed together, moreover, these sayings make a comprehensive set of sage observations and unorthodox instructions. They delight in critical comment, the everyday world, and they recommend unconventional behavior. These sayings put us in touch with the earliest stage of the Jesus movement, when aphoristic discourse was the norm. I shall refer to this period in the social history of the movement as stage 1. The blocks of material in Q1 build upon this aphoristic core by adding arguments to confirm its insights and by developing rules for living creatively in the light of its critical assessment of the everyday world. I shall refer to the social experience reflected in the blocks of Q1. Excuse me. Material as stage 2 to catch the flavor of discourse from the pre-Q1 period of the Jesus movement, stage 1. It will help to list the following aphorisms, paraphrased in some cases in order to highlight the point and encourage a fresh look. How fortunate the poor, they have the kingdom. QS 8. Everybody embraces their kin. QS 9. The standard you use will be the standard used against you. QS 10. Can the blind lead the blind? QS 11. A student is not better than his teacher. QS 11. A good tree does not bear rotten fruit. QS 13. Foxes have dens, birds have nests, but humans have no home. QS 19. The harvest is abundant, the workers few. QS 20. Everyone who asks receives. QS 27. Nothing is secret that will not be revealed. QS 35. People are worth much more than the birds. QS 36. Life is more than food. QS 39. The body is more than clothing. QS 39. Where your treasure, there your heart. QS 40. Everyone who glorifies himself will be humble. QS 50. Whoever tries to protect his life will lose it. QS 52. If salt is saltless, it is good for nothing. QS 53. These sayings are not uniquely brilliant, but they are pungent. Some observations are keen, others are mildly humorous, and some are laughable in the sense that the inversion of standard practices or attitudes has been pressed to the point of absurdity. Life in general is under review and conventional values under critique. The sayings about the good tree and the salt are examples of using proverbial lore to score an unnerving point. Everyone would have known about the good trees bearing good fruit and salt as a positive metaphor for sealing friendships and quote unquote seasoning a human relationship. But to make the observation that a good tree does not bear bad fruit or that the salt is worthless if it loses its saltiness tends to raise the eyebrows and call for circumspection. The saying about asking and receiving, on the other hand, invites a bit of introspection, as does the saying about the standard. At first, these truisms seem rather banal, but now, on second thought, one starts wondering whether they always apply, since none of them specifies the circumstances that must pertain in order for these sayings to always be true. They work to solicit a heightened awareness wherever one is involved in the give and take of human intercourse. Overall, the message of these sayings is that customary pretensions are hollow. Claim to superior status based on such things as wealth, learning, possessions, secrets, rank, and power is exposed as questionable, if not ridiculous. The perspective is that of the underdog, and the vision is that of those who can see through the emptiness, who already know that the emperor has no clothes. There is no sign of hostility towards those caught in the usual binds, and there is no suggestion of a program to change the system that supports questionable values. There is, however, a hint of pensiveness that attends the critique, a desire that those who hear it will come to share their perspective. The expose is also poignant because implicit in the critique is the assumption that there must be a better way to live. The better way is not spelled out with these aphorisms. One has only the sense that simplicity is better than pretension, that realistic assessment is a better guide than status, and that life would be more rewarding if lived another way. In general, it is clear that sympathies lie with the poor, the least, the humble, the servant, and those consigned to positions without privilege, more than with their social opposites. But more than this cannot be said without additional information. The aphoristic sayings just cited are phrased as maxims, which means they counted as statements that were considered generally true of the social world in view. If one now looks for aphoristic sayings that are phrased as imperatives, not maxims, a somewhat clearer picture of the better way to live begins to emerge. Instructions actually predominate in Q1, and most of the blocks of Q1 material are composed in support of instructions set forth as imperatives. Many of these imperatives are succinctly phrased and are aphoristic in character. Some of them appear to turn the observations in the maxims around and recommend a mode of behavior appropriate to the critical stance. This means that the better way of life was actually enjoined as livable. If we look for aphoristic imperatives that function as core pronouncements or clearly illustrate the theme in a cluster of Q1 sayings, the following sayings emerge, using paraphrase again to make the point. Rejoice when reproached, QS 8. Love your enemies, QS 9. Bless those who curse you, QS 9. If struck on one cheek, offer the other, QS 9. Give to everyone who begs, QS 9. Judge not and you won't be judged, QS 10. First remove the stick from your eye, QS 12. Leave the dead to bury their dead, QS 19. Go out as lambs among wolves, QS 20. Carry no money, bag, or sandals, QS 20. Greet no one on the road, QS 20. Eat what is set before you, QS 20. Ask and it will be given to you, QS 27. Don't be afraid, QS 36. Don't worry about your life, QS 39. Make sure of God's rule over you, QS 39. Sell your possessions and give to charity, QS 40. These admonitions build upon observations about life in the larger world and the need to be careful about accepting conventional codes of honor and ethics at face value. As instructions, the admonitions assume that the social world is an arena in which the people of Q will encounter those who are living by traditional rules. It is a jungle out there, and the behavior enjoined is risky. One can expect to meet up with wolves and those who may curse and reproach you. The advice is to be cautious but also courageous. One should not respond in kind, but take the reproach in stride and with confidence that one is right. One should discard unnecessary trappings and live the simple, unencumbered life. When asked, give. When in need, ask. The challenge is not to be consumed with worry. One wonders at the crisp formulations of such a curious challenge. The forthright imperatives evince a sense of seriousness, but why one should take them seriously is not expressly stated. In order to understand their attraction and significance, we need a fuller picture of the way of life that is being recommended. If we expand the database somewhat by noting the way in which these core aphorisms are elaborated in the larger blocks of Q1, a number of themes surface for repeated emphasis. The list includes such items as the following: voluntary poverty, QS 38, QS 39, and QS 40. Lending without expectation of return, QS 9. Critique of riches, QS 8, QS 38, and QS 40. Etiquette for begging, QS 9, QS 27. Etiquette for troublesome encounters in public, QS 20. Non-retaliation, QS 9, QS 10, and QS 20. Rejoicing in the face of reproach, QS 8. Severance of family ties, QS 19, QS 52. Renunciation of needs, QS 8, QS 19, QS 39, and QS 40. Call for authenticity, QS 13, QS 35, QS 53. Critique of Hypocrisy, QS 12. Fearless and Carefree Attitude, QS 36 and QS 39. Confidence in God's Care, QS 26, QS 27. Sense of Vocation, QS 19, QS 20. Discipleship Without Pretension, QS 11, QS 14, QS 38, QS 50, and QS 52. Single-mindedness in the Pursuit of God's Kingdom, QS 19, QS 39, QS 40, QS 52, and QS 53. These themes point to a way of life that historians recognize as a pattern of behavior highly recommended by popular philosophers during the Hellenistic and Greco-Roman periods. Q1 enjoins a practical ethic of the times widely known as Cynic. That's spelled Cynic. New Testament scholars have often remarked on the Cynic parallels to much of the material in Q1. Since such similarity often comes as a surprise to Christian readers of the Gospels, accustomed as they are to hearing the words of Jesus against the background of the prophetic speech of the Hebrew Scriptures, few have concluded that the cynic analogy should be taken seriously. A cynic look-alike Jesus would, in any case, present something of an embarrassment due to the fact that the cynics are remembered mostly for their unlovable ways. The modern caricature of the ancient cynics usually calls to mind the unsavory figure of Diogenes of Sinope and dwells upon his habits of biting sarcasm and public obscenities. To be cynical in modern parlance is also fraught with negative connotation. Cynicism is equated with disengaged negativity, giving up rather than confronting the challenges of life. To be cynical is never thought to be helpful when questions about the meaning of life are seriously under review. The modern caricature of the ancient cynics is inaccurate, and the modern use of the word cynic to describe the ancient cynics is unfair. A more balanced view would see the cynics as the Greek analog to the Hebrew prophets. Cynics played a very important social role as critics of conventional values and oppressive forms of governance for approximately 1,000 years, from the 5th century BCE to the 6th century CE. Their popular philosophy produced such figures as Antisthenes, Diogenes, Crates, Bion, Tellus, Meleager, Masonius Rufus, Dio, Chrysostomus, Demonax, Peregrinus Proteus, Sostratus, and Theagenes. But I apologize for any mispronouncements. All important figures in the history of Greek thought. Their gifts and graces ranged from the endurance of a life of renunciation in full public view through the courage to offer social critique in high places, called parrhesia or boldness of speech, to the learning and sophistication required for the espousal of cynic views at the highest level of literary composition. Justly famous as irritants to those who lived by the system and enjoyed the blessings of privilege, prosperity, and power, the Cynics were highly regarded for their achievement in honing the virtue of self sufficiency, autarkia. In the midst of uncertain times, Epictetus' third discourse as a remarkable revelation of a Stoic's high esteem for the Cynic's calling as an important social role, even during the imagined halcyon age of the Roman Imperium. The crisp sayings of Jesus in Q1 show that his followers thought of him as a Cynic light sage. Cynics were known for begging, voluntary poverty, renunciation of needs, severance of family ties, fearless and carefree attitudes, and troublesome public behavior. Standard themes in Cynic discourse included a critique of riches, pretension, and hypocrisy, such as in Q1. The Cynic style of speech was distinctly aphoristic, as is that in Q1, and Cynics were schooled in such topics as handling reproach, non retaliation, and authenticity in following their vocation. Matters at the forefront of Jesus' instructions in Q1. If Jesus was remembered as a Cynic like sage, we need to make sure we understand why the Cynics behaved as they did. The public image was that of the lone beggar who had renounced the comforts of life to pit himself against the elements and practice the virtues of living with little. The Cynic wore a telltale cloak and carried a pouch for the day's morsels and morrow's coins. A stick and sandals were allowed, but that was all. A favorite form, excuse me, I'm having a technical issue here. With my phone charging. Looks like my phone's getting hot with this topic. Holy moly. Anyway, the public image was that of the lone beggar who had renounced the comforts of life to pit himself against the elements and practice the virtues of living with little. The Cynic wore a telltale cloak and carried a pouch for the day's morsels and the morrow's coins. A stick and sandals were also allowed, but that was all. A favorite form of anecdote called Chariya used these groups to characterize the Cynic's resolve, depict him in the most destitute of straits, and explore the wit required to live with hunger, cold, and public reproach. Thus, when one of his students complained of the cold, Antisthenes told him to fold his cloak double. When a child used his hands to get a drink of water, Diogenes threw his cup away and said that a child had bested him in the contest for living simply. When someone slapped him in reproach, Diogenes asked himself out loud why he had forgotten to wear his helmet that day. We have hundreds of anecdotes that follow this form. The ancient Greeks got their point and delighted in their cleverness. These popular philosophers of a natural way of life did not wander off to suffer in silence. Their props were a setup for a little game of gotcha with the citizens of the town. Those who dared to give the Cynic any attention at all usually found themselves in contradiction. It mattered little whether a bystander or a passerby was generous or abusive. A scurrilous remark could be turned to advantage by exposing the underlying cultural taboo as ridiculous. An offer to help would also receive a put down by triggering some remark about those who have and those who do not. Either way, the cynic's purpose was to point out the disparities sustained by the social system and refuse to let the system put him in his place. According to one story, bystanders had commended a person for giving Diogenes a handout, whereupon he said, "Have you no praise for the one who was worthy to receive such a gift?" Thus, the marketplace was the cynic's platform, the place to display a living example of freedom from social and cultural constraints, and a place from which to address townspeople about the current state of affairs. As might be expected, the cynic was a favorite target for ridicule. That, of course, was just what the cynic wanted. Public performance and close encounter with the barefaced straits was exactly what the cynic vocation called for. The cynic response often seemed harsh and aggressive, but to make his point, there was always a touch of humor as well. The challenge for a cynic was to see the humor in a situation and quickly turn it to advantage. A large number of cynic anecdotes feature this ability. Some examples are the following stories about Diogenes of Sinope, recorded by Diogenes Laertius in his Lives of Eminent Philosophers. When told that people were laughing at him, Diogenes said, "But I am not laughed down." When asked why he was begging from a statue, he said, "To get practice in being refused." When asked what kind of wine he preferred, he replied, "The kind another pays for." When someone said that life was bad, he replied, "Not life itself, but living as you do." Oh my gosh. In our time, there is no single social role with which to compare the ancient cynics. But we do recognize the social critic and take for granted a number of ways in which social and cultural critique are expressed. These compare nicely with various aspects of the cynic's profession. For example, we are accustomed to the social critique of political cartoonists, stand up comedians, and especially of satire in the genre of the cabaret. All of these use humor to make their point. We are also accustomed to social critique in a more serious and philosophical vein, such as that represented by political commentary. And there is precedent for taking up an alternative lifestyle as social protest, from the utopian movement of the 19th century to the counterculture movement of the 1960s, to the environmental protest of the 1980s and 1990s. The list could be greatly expanded, for much modern entertainment also sets its scenes against the backdrop of the unexamined taboos and prejudices prevailing in our time. Each of these approaches to a critical assessment of our society, satire, commentary, and alternative lifestyle, bears some resemblance to the profession of the cynic sage in late antiquity. Those who study the cynic's wit soon discover that humor was more than an adornment to their game. Gotcha had rules, and the rules demanded that the cynic see and take advantage of the humor in a situation. To play the game and win, the cynic would have to accept a reproach by letting it stand as a statement that was true, a description of his behavior with which he would have to agree. Well, you're right. I did do that. I did say that. But then, by a series of rapid mental gymnastics, the cynic would seize on some feature of his opponent's statement that revealed an assumption with which the cynic did not agree, shift to another way of looking at situation or to a different set of circumstances in which the statement would not apply, and come up with a retort that exposed the challenger's statement as a naive cliche. A fine example of this strategy is found in the story about Diogenes, who, when reproached for entering unclean places, probably a euphemism for a house of prostitution, said, "But the sun enters the privies without being defiled." The retort lets the statement of his challengers stand, but shifts attention to a case in which entrance into an unclean place does not result in becoming unclean. For a moment, the confusion of categories strikes one as funny. It also creates a sense of uncertainty about the assumptions underlying the challenger's reproach. In the anecdote cited earlier, the critical twists from challenge to response shift in idiom, such as laughing at, laughing down. Purpose, beginning to get, begging as an exercise. Classification, kinds of things, kinds of human exchange. And quality, life in general, a certain lifestyle. The lack of fit when applying a common taboo to an inappropriate situation, or the gap between a challenge and the cynic's response, creates humor. But the humor covers a devastating, if momentary, insight into the partiality of conventional perceptions, and thereby offers a critical perspective on their underlying logic. Noting the cynic's wit should not divert our attention from their sense of vocation and purpose. Epictetus wrote that cynics should be likened to a spy or scout from another world or kingdom, whose assignment was to observe human behavior and render a judgment upon it. The cynic could also be likened to a physician sent to diagnose and heal a society's ills. If asked for his credentials, the cynic might well claim to be a messenger sent by the gods. Epictetus, at least, had no hesitation in finding such language fully appropriate, although for a Greek, such a reference to divine vocation could easily be made without creating mystique or claiming supernatural status. Thus, there was the method of the cynic's madness. In fact, leading cynics were often regarded as philosophers, and cynicism was frequently accorded rank among the schools of Greek philosophy. The Stoics sometimes claimed the Cynics as their precursors in order to trace their own school of thought back to Socrates. But everyone knew that Cynic intellectuals did not organize schools in the grand tradition and were not impressed with abstract conceptual systems put forth to explain an ordered universe. They were much more interested in the question of virtue, arete, arete, or how an individual should live given the failure of social and political systems to support what they called a natural way of life. They borrowed freely from any and every popular ethical philosophy, such as that of Stoics, to get a certain point across. That point was the cost of one's intelligence and integrity if one blindly followed social convention and accepted its customary rationalizations. Cynics had no trouble appealing to the intelligence of the people. They trusted the capacity of the average person to see through the rhetoric of common discourse and assess a human situation at its grubby level of personal desire and manipulation. Their task was not to pose as teachers of truths. People did not know, but to challenge people to live in accordance with what they did know. They constantly called attention to the accidental nature of social status and the ephemeral rewards of material success. They criticized social structures of hierarchy, domination, and inequity by poking fun at the superficial codes of honor and shame that supported them. They took every opportunity to deflate the egos of the privileged, and they delighted in exposing the ulterior motive of the calculated action. What counted most, they said, was a sense of personal worth and integrity. One should not allow others to determine one's worth on the scale of social position. One already possessed all the resources one needed to live sanely and well by virtue of being a human being. Why not be true to the way in which the world actually impinges upon you? Say what you want and what you mean. Respond to a situation as you see it in truth, not as the usual proprieties dictate. Do not let the world squeeze you into its mold. Speak up and act out. Verve was therefore the cynic virtue. It was generated by a sense of self reliance, but involved the capacity for taking a lively interest in any and every encounter with another human being. Verve could also be used as a standard to diagnose human well being, rank human achievement, and assess the merits of social systems and their cultural symbols. Nevertheless, the cynic critique of cultural conventions finally came to rest, not on society as a system, but on the shoulders of the individual who was willing to live according to nature. The invitation was to take courage and swim against the social currents that threatened to overwhelm and silence a person's sense of verve. Such a philosophy was custom made for Galilean circumstance during the late Hellenistic period. The age old Galilean strategies for accommodating foreign rulers would have been hard pressed under the accelerated shifts in governance that were taking place. Shrugs with respect to the loyalties demanded by foreign kings, priests, and generals were no longer sufficient to survive with sanity in the face of the layered and pervasive political forces in power. Add to that the widespread malice and sense of social uncertainty of the time, and Galilee, as the land of the nations, turn, turns out to be a likely spot for a cynic style social critique. The Jesus people are best understood as those who noticed the challenge of the times in Galilee. They took advantage of the mix of peoples to tweak the authority of any cultural tradition that presumed to set the standard for others. They found a way to encourage one another in the pursuit of sane and simple living. And they developed a discourse that exuded the cynic spirit. The aphorisms in Q1 set the cynic like tone, and the injunctions reveal a strong sense of vocation that corresponds to the cynic way of life. The Jesus movement began as a homegrown variety of cynicism in the rough and ready circumstance of Galilee before the war. Several inferences about the movement can be drawn from this core of aphoristic material. Beliefs were not a major concern. Behavior was what mattered, and the arena for the action was in public. The public sphere was not subjected to a systematic analysis. However, as if society's ills had been traced to this or that particular cause. The social world was under review, to be sure, for the behavior recommended was intentionally non conventional, mildly disruptive, and implicitly countercultural. But there is no indication that the purpose of this behavior was to change society at large. The way society worked in general was taken for granted, in the sense of what more can one expect? Instead, the imperatives were addressed to individuals as if they could live by other rules if they chose to do so. It is important to see that there was no sense of external institutional threat to motivate this change in lifestyle. It is especially important to see that the purpose of the change was not a social reform. The Jesus people were not organizing to fight Roman power or to reform Jewish religion. A movement based on such a personal challenge was nevertheless capable of generating a social vision. The blocks of material in Q1 to which we now turn are proof that many responded to the movement and that an association of like minded persons began to form. Because of the aphoristic core, there's still a distinct undercurrent of elan in this material, some hints of humor, and a decidedly self assured attitude that pervades the whole. But when one reads the blocks of material as units designed to argue for attitudes that should be normative for the group, the mischievous, zesty tone of the aphoristic core diminishes. As soon as this feature is seen, the cynic analogy begins to fade. Cynics formed a class of persons who shared a kind of mutual respect. But to be a cynic hardly meant belonging to a movement that involved meetings or the formation of a group guided by a social notion. In the case of the Jesus people, however, signs of social formation can be detected even among the core aphorisms of Q1. And membership in a movement fully determines the tenor of block compositions that built upon that core. This feature of the Jesus movement appears to be distinctive. The signs of social formation at the earliest stage of the tradition, stage one, are one, the shift that seems to have taken place from aphoristic discourse, meaning how fortunate the poor, to maxim like generalizations, where your treasure, there your heart. Number two, the high incidence of imperative injunctions. Sell your possessions and give to charity. Number three, the use of the second person plural to address readers. Number four, a heightened interest in the effect of challenging encounter on the quality of a human relationship. And number five, a hint of fascination with what might be called an egalitarian view of social roles and ranking. Turning to the stage two units of composition, a heightened self awareness about belonging to a movement is obvious, and a social vision can be discerned. And now an odd thing happened. Injunctions formulated in the earlier aphoristic style evolved into rules for the group and were supported by arguments. This is most curious, for an aphoristic view of the social world and a challenge to live against its codes are hardly an adequate foundation for constructing positive community rules and ethical principles. Nevertheless, such a development is exactly what took place in the Jesus movement. Excuse me. The block of material concerning food and clothing in the QS 39 provides a clear example of this development. The unit is composed on the model of a pattern of argumentation that Hellenistic teachers of rhetoric called a thesis or an elaboration. In this case, an especially demanding cynic-like injunction was set forth in the form of a thesis and argued as a principle. To see the argument at work, one needs to know that in ancient rhetoric, maxims, analogies, and examples counted as proofs that stacking them up in a certain way was considered a complete argumentation. Analogies were used take you excuse me. Analogies were usually taken from the natural order, while examples were taken from life. If complete argumentation was well done, it was thought to be persuasive. QS 39 is a complete argument on the thesis that one should not worry. Thesis: one should not worry about life, food, or body, clothing. Reason: life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Analogy: ravens do not work for food. God provides for them. You are worth more than birds. Example: no one can add a day to life by worrying. Analogy: lilies do not work, yet are clothed. Example: Solomon in all his splendor was not as magnificent as the lilies. Analogy: notice the grass. If God puts beautiful clothes on the grass, won't he put clothes on you? Conclusion: one should not worry about food and drink. Example: all the nations worry about such things. Exhortation: instead, make sure of God's rule over you, and all these things will be yours as well. New notations and features of discourse enter to the tradition in this argumentation in support of the movement's ethos. Especially important to R1, the reference to the ruler kingdom of God. 2, the express appeal to nature as a manifestation of the divine. And 3, the use of an example from epic history, Solomon. These features show that reflection on the movement had occurred and that a way had been found to give a reasoned account of its otherwise odd persuasions. Don't worry about food and clothing. It is important to see that the processes of social formation and rationalization go hand in hand, and that this is not the only block of material in Q1 in which such intellectual activity can be detected. Every block of Q1 material exhibits the same strategy. QS8 moves from the aphoristic, how fortunate the poor, to a tripartite characterization of the Jesus people, the poor, the hungry, and those with reason to mourn. And finally, to a blessing on those who suffer rejection because of their association with the Jesus movement. QS9 contains the cynic-like injunction to bless those who curse you, and then develops it into an elaborate explication of what it means to love your enemies. QS 10 turns the cautionary injunction, don't judge and you won't be judged, into an ethical principle with theological consequences. QS 11 takes the cynic like observation about the blind leading the blind as an occasion to introduce a warning not to think of oneself as more sage than one's teacher. QS 12 hovers on the border between a charge against hypocrites with sticks in their eyes and an injunction to take care of one's own blind spots before criticizing a brother. QS 13 turns the unnerving observation about trees and their fruit into a moralistic admonition to match what you say with what you really think. QS 14 illustrates the import of a sharp riposte. Why call me master and not do what I tell you? With a parable about building a house that can last. If the core of the prayer in the QS 26 is the request for daily bread, a cynic theme, it has been embedded in a thoroughly theologized, oh boy, my tongue, theologized social piety. In QS 27, the beggar's delight, ask and it will be given you, has been transformed into a comforting community maxim about the assurance of God's care. In QS 38, a cynic like put down, sir, who made me your judge or lawyer? Leads to a moralistic parable about the tragic fate of a rich man who did not make the right judgment about his goods. In the thoroughly cynic injunction in QS 40 to sell one's possessions and give to charity was turned into a promise of treasure in heaven. So QS 39 is not the only block of Q1 material that bears the marks of reflection upon a cynic-like movement in the process of social and ethical formation. What, pray tell, was going on? There's only one term in all of Q1 that refers to the movement and its purposes. That is the term Kingdom of God, Basileia tou Theo, a term that connotes both the power and authority of God to rule or execute a judgment, as well as a realm or domain within God's rule was fully actualized. The rule of God is what the Q people said they were representing in the world. For us, the problem with the term is that the Q people used it in a wide range of reference and took its meaning for granted. Scholars have therefore had a very difficult time understanding its range of connotation and finding a suitable translation. The kingdom of God is governed by laws. The cosmos was viewed as the eternal city in which all human beings lived as cosmopolitans, and hope for better times was sustained by projections of the ideal kingdom into the future. The other turn took place in the schools of popular ethical philosophy. As frequently happens, ideal models of a social system can be used as reflectors to think through basic questions about the system. Once abstracted, however, a social model can also be used to reflect upon the individual's place in the structure of the system and on the individual as a microcosm of the system. Not surprisingly, therefore, given the malice created by the devolution of traditional social systems and the dislocation of people from familiar structures of law, the language of rule or kingship came to be used as a metaphor for personal self-control. The term king no longer had to refer to an actual ruler, and kingdom no longer had to refer to a political domain. King became a metaphor of a human being at its highest imaginable level, whether of endowment, achievement, ethical excellence, or mythical ideal. Kingdom became a metaphor for the sovereignty manifest in the independent bearing, freedom, confidence, and a self control of the superior person, the person of ethical integrity, who thus could rule his world imperiously. Stoics internalized the image of the king and idealized the individual who ruled his passions and controlled his attitudes, even in circumstances where others governed his existence. Their strategy was to be hopeful about the constructive influence of such individuals on society. A popular Stoic maxim was the only true king is the wise man. Cynics were not as sanguine about the philosopher's chance of influencing social reform, but they also used the royal metaphor to advantage. In their case, taking control of one's life required extrication from the social scene. They lived according to nature, they said, and the natural order was imagined as a realm of divine rule in opposition to the prevailing social order. As Epictetus put it, the cynic's staff was his scepter. His mission was to represent the great King Zeus, and the cynic's sovereignty was the imperious bearing, which he ruled in the public arena by telling and showing others how they should live. The use of the term kingdom of God in Q1 matches its use in the traditions of popular philosophy, especially in the Cynic tradition of performing social diagnostics in public by means of countercultural behavior. The aphoristic imperatives recommended a stance towards life in the world that could become the basis for an alternative community ethos and ethic among those willing to consider an alternative social vision. Thus, the spread of connotation must be kept in mind when encountering the term God's kingdom in Q. The language of the kingdom of God in Q captures precisely the ambiguities involved in the range of connotation, from ruling as behavior to rule as domain, from individual to group, behavior to ethos, practice to conceptual order, human society to divine order. The thought had not yet occurred at the Q1 level as it did later at the Q2 stage, that the location of God's kingdom was to be found precisely in the social formation of the movement. But it is clear that an overlap had already occurred between the concept of the rule of God as an alternative realm or a way of life everywhere available to daring individuals on the one hand, and the ethos of the movement as the particular manifestation of God's kingdom on the other. That is why the language of the rule of God in Q1 refers not only to the challenge of risky living without expectation that the social world will change, but also to the exemplification of a way of life that like minded persons might want to share. The God in question is not identified in terms of any ethnic or cultural tradition. This fits nicely with Galilean provenance, and since the metaphors of God's rule are largely taken from the realm of nature, the conception of God in Q1 is also compatible with the cynic tone of the teachings. The match between the cynics and the Q people is not exact, however, mainly because the cynics had no interest in emphasizing the divine aspect of either the natural order or the rule they represented. The people of Q, on the other hand, did emphasize that the rule they represented was the rule of God. There is little more to be learned about the nature of this God from the sayings about his kingdom, but other sayings about God in Q1, paraphrased below, represent him as a father. Love your enemies, do good, and lend without expecting anything in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of God. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good. He sends rain on the just and on the unjust. QS 9. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful. QS 10. Father, give us, pardon us, do not bring us to trial. QS 26. If you who are not good know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will the Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? QS 27. If God puts beautiful clothes on the grass, won't he put clothes on you? Your Father knows that you need these things. QS 39. The concept of God as a father was widespread at the time, so the Jesus people were not laying claim to any particular tradition of religious thinking or inventing a new theology. Their conception is universal in the sense that all of nature is God's domain and all of kinds of people are under his care. And yet, the way in which the Q people talked about God strikes a note of seriousness that is not evident in the earlier aphoristic materials. The seriousness is not about coming to a proper understanding of God, for the Father is merely the guarantor of the better way of life demonstrated by the movement. The seriousness is about the movement itself and the care of its members. God is emphasized as being a father because the members of the movement are in need of a father's care. The Q people are not yet thinking of themselves as a family, but they are getting close. In Q1, the embryonic social formation of the movement has to be inferred from the nature of the discourse. In Q2, on the other hand, a vivid picture of the Jesus movement comes into view as a fully self-conscious movement. Before we move to the stage of the group's history, however, there is one more important window into the early period of socialization that Q1 provides. And this is the instruction about working for God's kingdom in QS 20. This instruction contains the saying about being sent out as lambs among wolves, a formulation that retains its cynic flavor and is best understood as an address to individuals. However, it also contains a saying about a large harvest with few workers, a saying that implies some kind of program. And appended to the harvest saying is the injunction to beg the master of the harvest to send out laborers. Recent studies of this instruction have argued convincingly that of these two sayings, the one about the lambs and wolves is the earlier. This means that the developmental sequence discernible in Q1 as a whole is also true of this instructional unit. An originally cynic-like challenge to go out into public arena and confront the wolves was changed into an instruction befitting a movement with a collective sense of mission. But what kind of mission might have been? The injunction to beg the master of harvest to send out workers into his harvest assumes a stage in the movement when house groups had developed and thought of themselves as appropriate form of Jesus people. In fact, the speech as a whole pivots on a single issue. It is the question of appropriate behavior in the event of being welcomed or not received when entering a house in another town. The instructions for the road are that one should not wear a pouch or sandals, should not carry a staff, and should not greet anyone. Reception at a house depends on a child of peace being there and is signaled by an exchange of the traditional greeting. Peace. Behavior is spelled out in terms of conventional rules of hospitality. Eat what they provide. Do not offend the host by accepting another's hospitality and going on to another house. While with one's host, one should attend to the sick and tell them that God's rule has come near to you. However, there is no instruction about what to do at the house should the traveler not be welcomed. Such instruction is offered only in regard to a city that does not receive the worker, in which case a gesture, apparently of accusation, is to be performed, shaking the dust from one's feet on leaving. This means that the movement had experienced rejection in public. The instructions for the road are particularly interesting because they are concerned with just those items that typify the cynic's garb and manner. Why are these items forbidden? Some scholars have thought that the Q people may have wanted to outdo other cynics in their renunciation of basic needs, but the instruction may have been not to dress any longer like a cynic. Either way, a contrast is being made, and the rest of the instructions may tell us why. The reason seems to be that the public arena was no longer the place where the most important activity was occurring within the movement. At this time, there were houses where Jesus' people sought hospitality and talked about the rule of God. The instructions suggest that the Q people had become interested in the etiquette of cordial relations among houses of hospitality and spelled out rules for the behavior of workers when traveling to other towns. Begging had been modulated into requesting hospitality as a representative of the movement. One gets the impression of a network of house groups interested in staying in touch. It is clear that these instructions were formulated as guidance for a movement that had spread through Galilee, and that Jesus' people who were not personal acquaintances might be found in other towns. Spreading would have taken place in the normal course of contact, and travel wherever talk about God's rule caught the attention of persons willing to listen. Apparently, many were quite attracted to the Jesus people and their talk about the rule of God. Their diagnosis of the social situation must have made sense, and their challenge to risk reproach by taking in hand while one could of one's own life must have sounded right. But as groups formed in different places and teachings of the Jesus became the topic of conversations, recognition of kindred spirits became an issue, and the arena of activity shifted from the public sphere to the house group. The earlier cynic like lifestyle, geared as it was for a critical encounter with the world, would have become inappropriate. What it meant to live in accordance with the rule of God would now have to be worked out in relation to persons and problems within the group. Thus, the codification of cynic like injunctions as community rules in Q1 can be understood as a response to the problems of social formation. As we shall see, these problems surfaced in Q2 as the primary cause for a marked shift in both discourse and the lifestyle of the Jesus movement. And that was part 3.1, Dancing to the Pipes, from the book The Lost Gospel, the book of Q and Christian Origins. So if you've listened this far, thank you for listening. And the next reading will be 3.2, Singing a Dirge. Thank you so much for listening.